When the cameras started recording in the Roosevelt Room that Tuesday morning, no one knew that in 30 seconds, the most viral political moment in internet history would be born. Trump's words, "You don't belong in this room," would become his greatest regret when faced with Jasmine's 8-word response that would shatter his authority forever. The Roosevelt Room always looked smaller in person than it did on television. Representative Jasmine Crockett had been there before, 3 times to be exact, but today felt different. The air carried a tension that seemed to press against the mahogany walls, thick with decades of presidential history and the weight of decisions that had shaped nations. She sat in her usual chair, the one closest to the windows that faced the rose garden, wearing a navy blazer that her chief of staff had chosen specifically because it photographed well under the harsh fluorescent lights that the White House communications team insisted on using for their informal meetings. But there was nothing informal about this gathering. The meeting had been called to discuss education policy reform, a subject that Jasmine knew intimately from her days walking the halls of underfunded schools in Texas, listening to teachers who bought supplies with their own grocery money, and students who ate their only hot meals in cafeterias with peeling paint and broken air conditioning. President Trump entered the room at exactly 10:17 a.m., 17 minutes late, which was actually early by his standards. He moved with the particular swagger of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered, his red tie slightly askew, his hair showing the effects of what had clearly been a frustrating morning dealing with whatever crisis was trending on the news cycle. Behind him trailed the usual collection of advisors, aides, and hangers-on who formed the shifting constellation of influence that surrounded every president. But today, there was something different in their demeanor, a nervous energy that suggested they were expecting fireworks. "Let's make this quick," Trump announced as he settled into his chair at the head of the table, not bothering with pleasantries or acknowledgments of the congressional representatives who had been waiting for him. "I've got real work to do." Jasmine felt the familiar tightening in her chest that she'd learned to recognize as her body's preparation for battle. It wasn't fear. She'd moved past fear years ago, sometime between watching her brother get arrested for a crime he didn't commit and listening to her mother pray in the courthouse hallway while lawyers in expensive suits decided his fate with the casual indifference of people who had never had to choose between rent money and bail money. No, this wasn't fear. This was recognition. She recognized the tone, the dismissive wave of the hand, the way Trump's eyes skipped over her as if she were part of the furniture rather than an elected representative of the people of Texas. She'd seen it before, in courtrooms and city council meetings and school board hearings, where men in suits talked over women who actually knew what they were talking about. But this was different. This was the Roosevelt Room. This was the seat of American power, and this was being broadcast live to the American people who had sent her here to speak for them. The conversation started predictably enough. Education Secretary Patricia Williams presented a series of charts and graphs that painted a rosy picture of American schools. Test scores trending upward, graduation rates improving, teacher satisfaction at historic highs, according to surveys that Jasmine strongly suspected had been conducted in districts where teachers could afford to live in the same communities where they worked. "The numbers speak for themselves," Secretary Williams concluded, her voice carrying the confident authority of someone who had never eaten a school lunch that came from a package or tried to teach chemistry without enough beakers for every student to have their own. Jasmine waited for her turn to speak, watching as various representatives offered their comments, mostly supportive, carefully worded statements that praised the administration's efforts while suggesting minor tweaks around the edges. Standard political theater, the kind of performative governance that looked good in press releases but didn't change the fact that kids in her district were still reading textbooks that listed George W. Bush as the current president. When Chairman Morrison finally called on her, Jasmine opened the folder she'd brought with her. Not a prop, not a theatrical device, but actual documentation that she'd compiled during her visits to schools across Texas over the past 6 months. "Mr. President," she began, her voice carrying the measured tone she'd learned in law school and perfected in courtrooms where judges didn't appreciate emotional outbursts. "With respect, I think we're looking at different numbers." She held up a photograph, a fourth-grade classroom in Houston where students were sitting on the floor because there weren't enough desks, where the teacher had taped garbage bags over broken windows to keep out the rain, where the technology initiative consisted of 3 laptops that worked when the Wi-Fi was functioning. "This is Roosevelt Elementary," she continued, and she could see Trump's jaw tighten at the irony of the name. "Named after the same president whose portrait is watching us from that wall. The students there, American students, Mr. President, are learning about American democracy in a building where the roof leaks, where the heat doesn't work, where the library hasn't received a new book since 2018. The room had grown quiet in the way that rooms do when someone says something that makes people uncomfortable, when the carefully maintained fiction of political discourse bumps up against the jagged edges of actual reality." "Congresswoman," Trump interrupted, his voice carrying a warning that she chose to ignore, "we're here to discuss policy, not to listen to sob stories about schools that..." "Schools that what, Mr. President?" Jasmine asked, her voice remaining perfectly level even as she felt her heart rate increase. "Schools that don't matter, students who don't count, teachers who don't deserve to work in buildings that don't make them sick." She placed another photograph on the table. This one showed a teacher, Maria Santos, a woman who had been teaching for 15 years and still lived with 3 roommates because her salary wasn't enough to afford her own apartment in the district where she worked. Maria Santos teaches 34 students in a classroom designed for 20. She spends $3,000 of her own money every year on supplies because the district can't afford to provide them. She's working a second job at Target on weekends to pay her student loans from the education degree that qualified her to teach America's children for poverty wages. Trump's face was reddening now, not with embarrassment but with anger. Jasmine could see it building, the particular kind of rage that came from being challenged by someone he considered beneath his notice. "Ms. Santos chose her profession," he said, his voice taking on the condescending tone that had become his trademark. "No one forced her to become a teacher. If she wants more money, she can get a real job." The silence that followed was deafening. Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably. Secretary Williams looked like she wanted to disappear. Even Trump's own aides exchanged glances that suggested they knew their boss had just crossed a line. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She'd heard worse, much worse, from judges who thought a young black woman had no business representing clients in their courtrooms, from opposing counsel who assumed she was a paralegal or a court reporter, from men who thought her voice didn't belong in spaces where real decisions were made. "A real job," she repeated quietly, letting the words hang in the air like smoke from a house fire. "Teaching America's children isn't a real job." "Look," Trump said, leaning forward across the table, his eyes finally focusing on her with the full weight of his attention. "I don't know what school you went to or how you ended up in Congress, but this isn't some community college debate club. This is the White House. This is where real policy gets made by people who understand how the world actually works." And then came the words that would change everything. "You don't belong in this room." Time has a strange way of slowing down during moments that will later be remembered as pivotal. Jasmine would later recall the exact texture of the silence that followed Trump's words, not empty silence, but the kind of loaded quiet that comes when everyone in a room realizes they've just witnessed something that can't be taken back. She could see the cameras, red lights blinking steadily, capturing every angle of what was happening. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders, the awareness that whatever she said next would be replayed and analyzed and dissected for years to come. But mostly, she felt calm. It was the same calm she'd felt in the courtroom when opposing counsel tried to rattle her with personal attacks. The same calm she'd felt walking into the Texas State House as the youngest woman ever elected to represent her district. The same calm she'd learned from her mother, who had taught her that dignity wasn't something you could give away. It was something you carried with you regardless of who tried to take it. She tapped her hand twice against her thigh, a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone watching, but her own private signal to herself. Don't speak yet. Don't rush it. Let the moment breathe. Because she understood something that Trump, for all his bluster and bravado, had never learned. Timing was everything. In courtrooms, in negotiations, in moments when the whole world was watching, the person who controlled the rhythm controlled the outcome. She let the silence stretch for exactly 30 seconds, long enough for Trump's words to sink in, long enough for everyone in the room to process what had just been said, long enough for the weight of his attack to settle over the room like a blanket. And then, looking directly into the camera, speaking not to Trump but to the millions of Americans who were watching, she said 8 words that would change the course of American political discourse. I was elected by the people, just like you. The simplicity of it was devastating. No raised voice, no dramatic gestures, no angry rhetoric or emotional appeals, just a fact delivered with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly who she was and exactly why she belonged wherever she chose to stand. Trump's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, anger, and finally something that looked almost like fear. Because in 8 words, Jasmine had reminded everyone watching that in a democracy, authority doesn't come from wealth or connections or the ability to intimidate people. It comes from the consent of the governed. And she had just reminded the President of the United States that he worked for the people, not the other way around. The clip hit social media before the meeting had even officially ended. Someone in the press pool, later revealed to be a junior reporter from CNN who had been live tweeting the Education Summit, isolated the moment, cut it clean, and posted it on Twitter with no caption beyond a simple emoji: fire. Within 5 minutes, it had been retweeted 10,000 times. Within 10 minutes, it was trending. Within an hour, it had jumped platforms: TikTok, Instagram, YouTube Shorts, even LinkedIn, where corporate executives were sharing it with captions about leadership in difficult moments and grace under pressure. But it wasn't just the speed of the viral spread that made this moment historic. It was the universality of the response. This wasn't a partisan moment that split along predictable political lines. This was something deeper, something that touched on fundamental questions about respect, dignity, and what it means to belong in America. Teachers shared it with comments about feeling seen and validated for the first time in years. Students posted reaction videos from classrooms across the country, many of them with tears in their eyes as they watched someone stand up for their education and their teachers. Parents wrote long Facebook posts about wanting their children to see what real leadership looked like. But perhaps most powerfully, the clip resonated with anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. In a classroom, in a boardroom, in a country their families had called home for generations, but where they were still treated as guests who might have their invitation revoked at any moment. As teacher Maria, 23, who turned out to be the actual Maria Santos that Jasmine had mentioned, posted a video of herself crying in her classroom, thanking Jasmine for saying what we've all been feeling but didn't know how to say. High school debate shared a clip from a civics class in Philadelphia where students were analyzing Jasmine's response, breaking down the rhetorical techniques she'd used and discussing why her calm delivery had been more effective than any amount of shouting could have been. Grandma, Nebraska, an 82-year-old woman who had apparently learned to use TikTok during the pandemic, posted a video that went viral all on its own. That young woman didn't need to raise her voice or call anyone names. She just told the truth. That's what we used to call class. But the most telling responses came from international viewers. The clip was being shared in dozens of languages, with subtitles that couldn't quite capture the nuanced power of Jasmine's delivery, but managed to convey the essential message. In America, at least in theory, every voice mattered. The BBC ran a segment analyzing the exchange as an example of soft power in action. A political science professor at Oxford was quoted as saying, "This is what American democracy looks like when it's working properly. Not the loudest voice winning, but the most authentic one." Even critics of Jasmine's politics found themselves grudgingly admiring her composure. Conservative commentator Tucker Carlson, who had spent years attacking her positions on immigration and health care, admitted on his show that, whatever you think of her policies, you have to respect the way she handled herself in that room. 3,000 miles away from the Roosevelt Room, in a 4th grade classroom in Lansing, Michigan, teacher Jennifer Walsh paused the live stream she'd been showing her students and turned to face a room full of 9-year-olds who had just witnessed something that none of them fully understood, but all of them felt. "What did you notice about how she responded?" Mrs. Walsh asked, using the same questioning technique she employed when teaching reading comprehension. A girl in the back row, Destiny Williams, whose mother worked 2 jobs and whose father was serving his second deployment in Afghanistan, raised her hand tentatively. She didn't yell, Destiny said, but she still made him quiet. Mrs. Walsh nodded encouragingly. Why do you think that worked? Because she wasn't being mean back, offered Marcus Chen, whose parents had immigrated from Taiwan and who had been dealing with playground comments about going back where he came from since kindergarten. She was just telling the truth. And what truth was that? Mrs. Walsh asked. That people picked her to be there, said Aisha Thompson, whose grandmother had been one of the first black students to integrate the local high school in 1965. Just like they picked him. Mrs. Walsh felt something catch in her throat. These kids who were just learning about democracy in textbooks with pictures of the Capitol and the White House, had understood something that many adults seemed to miss, that in America, your right to be heard wasn't supposed to depend on who you were or where you came from, but on whether the people had chosen you to speak for them. That afternoon, she assigned her students to write about a time when someone had told them they didn't belong somewhere, and how they had responded or wished they had responded. The essays that came back were heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure, stories of kids who had been told they were too young, too poor, too different, too much or not enough of something that someone else had decided was important. But threaded through all of them was a new kind of confidence, a sense that there was another way to respond to being dismissed or diminished, not with anger or aggression, but with the simple, powerful assertion of their own worth and their own right to take up space in the world. Similar scenes were playing out in classrooms across the country. High school civics teachers were using the clip to discuss rhetorical strategies and the power of remaining calm under pressure. College professors were incorporating it into courses on political communication and leadership. Even elementary school counselors were using Jasmine's response as an example of how to deal with bullies, not by fighting back, but by standing firm in your own truth. But to understand the full power of Jasmine's response in that moment, you had to know where it came from. You had to understand the journey that had brought her to that chair in the Roosevelt Room, facing down the most powerful man in America, with nothing but 8 words and the unshakable conviction that she belonged wherever the people had sent her. It started 32 years earlier, in a small house in East Dallas, where 8-year-old Jasmine Crockett sat on a porch that slanted slightly to the left, watching her older brother Marcus get handcuffed in the front yard while their mother stood in the doorway, crying and praying in Spanish and English and languages that existed only in the space between heartbreak and hope. Marcus was 15. He'd been walking home from basketball practice when someone robbed a convenience store 6 blocks away. The description was vague: young black male, tall, wearing a basketball jersey, and in a neighborhood where every young black male was considered suspicious by default. That was enough for arrest. The charges were eventually dropped when the actual perpetrator was caught trying to rob another store while Marcus was sitting in juvenile detention. But the experience left scars that went deeper than the legal system could heal. Marcus had learned that his freedom was conditional, that his right to walk through his own neighborhood could be revoked at any moment by people who saw his skin color before they saw his humanity. Jasmine had learned something different. Sitting in that courthouse hallway while lawyers in expensive suits decided her brother's fate, she had realized that the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, and if she wanted it to work differently, she would have to get inside it and change it herself. That realization led her to join the debate team in high school, where she learned that words could be weapons more powerful than fists or bullets. Her coach, Mr. Henry, taught her that the strongest arguments weren't the loudest ones, but the ones that were impossible to refute because they were built on truth and delivered with unshakable conviction. Don't try to outshout them, he told her before her first tournament. Outthink them, out-prepare them. And when they try to rattle you, remember that you belong on that stage because you earned your way there. She carried that lesson with her to law school, where she was one of only 3 black women in her class, and where professors seemed genuinely surprised when she volunteered answers or asked questions that revealed she'd actually done the reading. She carried it with her into courtrooms where opposing counsel tried to dismiss her as an affirmative action hire or a diversity token. She carried it into her first political campaign when her opponent literally laughed at her announcement speech and called her a temporary flair in a long game. She beat him by 4 percentage points and gave a victory speech that was so gracious and professional that even his supporters found themselves applauding. But the real test came 2 years later, when she ran for Congress in a district that had been redrawn specifically to dilute the voting power of communities like the one where she'd grown up. The conventional wisdom was that she couldn't win. She was too young, too liberal, too outspoken for a district where moderate Democrats were supposed to win by keeping their heads down and not making waves. Instead, she walked door to door in August heat that melted makeup off her face before noon, talking to voters who had been ignored by politicians for so long that they'd stopped believing their voices mattered. She listened to teachers who were leaving the profession because they couldn't afford to keep teaching. She heard from parents who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't afford their children's prescription medications. She met with veterans who were waiting months for medical appointments and seniors who were choosing between food and medications. And at every stop, she made the same promise: if I ever forget who sent me here, send me home. It wasn't a campaign slogan or a focus group-tested soundbite. It was a sacred oath, a recognition that her seat in Congress wasn't hers to keep. It belonged to the people who had entrusted her with their hopes and their fears and their determination to build a better future for their children. She won that election by 8 percentage points, despite being outspent 3-1 by an opponent who had the backing of every major political organization in the state. Back in the Roosevelt Room, the immediate aftermath of Jasmine's response was a masterclass in political damage control in real time. You could actually see the moment when Trump's advisors realized that their boss had just committed a massive unforced error on live television. Chief of Staff Brian Halford was frantically typing on his phone, undoubtedly trying to coordinate a response strategy. Press Secretary Jennifer Walsh looked like she was calculating how many different ways she would have to explain away what had just happened. Even Trump himself seemed to understand that he had miscalculated, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, anger, and something that looked almost like panic. But it was too late. The words were out there, captured in high definition from multiple camera angles, preserved forever in the digital amber of the internet. There would be no walking this back, no explaining it away, no claiming that his words had been taken out of context. The rest of the meeting continued for another 23 minutes, but it was clear that everyone's attention was elsewhere. Education policy had suddenly become the least important thing in the room. What mattered now was the viral clip that was already spreading across social media like wildfire, and the political implications of a president who had just told a sitting congresswoman that she didn't belong in the White House. When the meeting finally ended, Jasmine gathered her materials with the same methodical care she brought to everything else. She shook hands with the other representatives, thanked the president for his time with the kind of professional courtesy that made his earlier behavior look even more petty and unpresidential, and walked out of the Roosevelt Room with her head high and her dignity intact. But as she walked through the corridors of the West Wing, past portraits of presidents who had shaped American history and artifacts that represented the best and worst of American democracy, she knew that something fundamental had just shifted. Not just in her own career or in the political landscape, but in the national conversation about who belonged where and whose voices mattered in the corridors of power. Her phone was buzzing constantly with calls and texts from colleagues, reporters, friends, and family members who had watched the exchange live. But she ignored them all. She would have time to process what had just happened, time to consider the implications and plan her next moves. Right now, she just wanted to get back to her office and return to the work she'd been elected to do. Because that was the thing that Trump and his advisors still didn't understand. She hadn't come to the White House to score political points or create viral moments. She'd come to advocate for her constituents, to speak truth to power, and to ensure that the voices of people who were rarely heard in rooms like the Roosevelt Room were represented at the highest levels of government. The viral moment was just a byproduct of doing her job. Within 6 hours of the clip going live, "Number You Don't Belong" was trending worldwide, but not in the way Trump's team might have hoped. Instead of people agreeing with the president's assessment, the hashtag became a rallying cry for everyone who had ever been told they didn't fit in, didn't measure up, or didn't have the right credentials to participate in American democracy. Teachers posted pictures of their overcrowded classrooms with captions like, "We belong in properly funded schools." Students shared graduation photos with, "We belong in affordable colleges." Veterans posted images from VA hospitals with, "We belong in proper healthcare facilities." Immigrants shared naturalization ceremony photos with, "We belong in the country we love." But perhaps most powerfully, elected officials from both parties began sharing their own stories of being told they didn't belong. Senator Elizabeth Warren tweeted about being told she was too aggressive when she questioned bank executives. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez shared a video about being told she was too young to understand economics. Even Republican Senator Susan Collins posted a statement about the importance of maintaining civility and respect in our political discourse. The international response was particularly striking. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau tweeted a video of Jasmine's response with the caption, "This is what leadership looks like." German Chancellor Angela Merkel, in her weekly press conference, was asked about the exchange and responded that democracies are strongest when all voices are heard and respected, regardless of their background or party affiliation. Perhaps most telling was the response from African leaders, many of whom had been on the receiving end of condescending treatment from American officials for decades. Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari tweeted simply, "Dignity. Respect. These are not American values or African values. They are human values." The economic impact was immediate and measurable. T-shirts with "I was elected by the people" were selling out faster than vendors could print them. Etsy shops were flooded with orders for mugs, posters, and bumper stickers featuring variations of Jasmine's 8-word response. A high school student in Oregon even created a TikTok dance to audio of Jasmine's voice saying, "Just like you," which was viewed 50 million times in the first week. But beyond the merchandise and the memes, something deeper was happening. Political science professors were already incorporating the exchange into their curricula as an example of effective communication under pressure. Leadership consultants were using it in corporate training seminars as a demonstration of how to maintain authority without resorting to aggression. High school debate coaches were showing it to their teams as a masterclass in timing and delivery. Back in Houston, Maria Santos, the teacher Jasmine had mentioned during the education summit, was sitting in her classroom grading papers when her phone started buzzing with notifications. At first, she ignored them. She had learned long ago that social media was often more distraction than help, and she had 34 sets of math homework to review before tomorrow morning. But when her daughter called, crying and laughing at the same time, Maria finally looked at her phone to see what was happening. "Mom, you need to see this," her daughter said. "Someone stood up for you. Someone finally stood up for all of us." Maria watched the clip 3 times before she fully processed what she was seeing. Here was a congresswoman, someone who could have been talking about education policy in abstract terms, discussing test scores and funding formulas and teacher retention rates. Instead, holding up a photograph of Maria's own classroom and speaking her name to the President of the United States. The emotional impact was overwhelming. For 15 years, Maria had felt invisible in the education policy debates that directly affected her daily life. She had watched politicians talk about teachers as if they were abstractions rather than real people with real challenges. She had seen policy experts who had never spent a day in a classroom make decisions that affected every aspect of her professional life. But now, suddenly, her reality was being discussed in the highest levels of government. Her struggles were being acknowledged. Her humanity was being recognized. The response from her students was equally powerful. When she arrived at school the next morning, she found a handwritten note taped to her classroom door. "Mrs. Santos, we saw the video. You belong here. Thank you for everything you do. Your 4th period class." Similar notes had been left by other classes throughout the day. By the end of the week, Maria's classroom walls were covered with messages from students expressing gratitude not just for her teaching, but for her persistence in staying in a profession that often seemed designed to drive good teachers away. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly, Maria found herself being interviewed about the reality of teaching in underfunded schools. She talked about spending her own money on supplies, about working weekends to afford her student loan payments, about loving her job despite the systemic challenges that made it almost impossible to do effectively. But she also talked about hope, about students who overcame incredible obstacles to achieve their dreams, about the privilege of being trusted with young minds during their most formative years, about the moments of breakthrough and understanding that made all the struggles worthwhile. Representative Crockett did something that politicians rarely do, Maria said during one interview. She saw us as people, not just talking points. She made our reality visible to people who have the power to change it. Meanwhile, in a small town outside Dallas, retired high school debate coach Henry Martinez was sitting in his favorite chair, watching the news coverage of his former student with a mixture of pride and something that felt almost like vindication. He had always known that Jasmine was special. Even in high school, she'd possessed a rare combination of intellectual rigor and emotional intelligence that set her apart from her peers. She could dissect complex arguments with surgical precision, but she never lost sight of the human impact of the policies being debated. He remembered the tournament where she had been facing off against a student from one of the wealthy suburban schools, a kid who had clearly been coached to use intimidation tactics and personal attacks to throw his opponents off balance. When the boy had suggested that Jasmine couldn't possibly understand economic policy because of her background, she had paused for exactly 3 seconds before responding with a detailed analysis of how economic policies affected working-class families like her own. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't taken the bait of personal attacks. She had simply redirected the conversation back to the substance of the debate, while subtly demonstrating that her background actually gave her insights that her privileged opponent couldn't match. The judges had unanimously declared her the winner, but more importantly, she had learned a lesson that would serve her well in the years to come, that the most powerful response to attempts at intimidation was often the calmest one. Still proud, still watching, he had texted her after seeing the Roosevelt Room clip. It was only 4 words, but it contained decades of mentorship, guidance, and belief in her potential. Her response had been equally brief, but deeply meaningful. "Thank you for teaching me that I belong wherever the argument takes me." The global response to the Roosevelt Room exchange revealed something interesting about America's role in the world and the expectations that other nations had for American leadership. For many international observers, the exchange wasn't just about domestic political dynamics. It was about whether America could live up to its own stated ideals about democracy, inclusion, and equal representation. Dr. Amara Okafor, a political scientist at the London School of Economics who specialized in American political culture, wrote an op-ed for The Guardian that captured the international perspective. What we witnessed in the Roosevelt Room was not just a political exchange, but a test of American democracy itself. When President Trump told Representative Crockett that she didn't belong in that room, he was essentially arguing that democratic legitimacy could be overridden by personal authority. When she responded that she had been elected by the people, just like him, she was reasserting the fundamental principle that, in a democracy, power derives from the consent of the governed, not from the whims of those who happen to hold office. Dr. Okafor's analysis was shared widely across European social media, where it sparked discussions about the fragility of democratic norms and the importance of leaders who understood that their authority was temporary and conditional. In Japan, the exchange was analyzed in the context of gender and power dynamics in politics. Professor Yuki Tanaka of Tokyo University noted that Jasmine's response demonstrated a form of political aikido, using her opponent's aggression against him by remaining centered and grounded in her own authority. In South Africa, where the legacy of apartheid had made questions of belonging and representation particularly resonant, Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu issued a statement praising Jasmine's grace under pressure and noting that true leadership is not about having the loudest voice, but about speaking truth with love and conviction. Perhaps most significantly, the clip was being shared widely in countries where democratic institutions were under threat. In Hong Kong, where pro-democracy activists were facing increasing pressure from Beijing, the 8-word response became a rallying cry for those fighting to maintain their own voices in governance. In Venezuela, where opposition politicians were being arrested for speaking out against the government, Jasmine's calm defiance became a symbol of resistance. 6 months later, the effects of that 30-second exchange were still rippling through American political culture. Political consultants were studying Jasmine's response as a template for how to handle hostile confrontations. Communications professionals were incorporating her techniques into their training programs. Even corporate executives were learning from her example of how to maintain authority and dignity when facing aggressive challenges. High schools were incorporating the clip into their civics curricula, using it to teach students about rhetorical strategy, emotional intelligence, and the power of staying calm under pressure. College courses on political communication were analyzing every aspect of the exchange, from Jasmine's strategic use of silence to the way she positioned her response as a statement of fact rather than an opinion. Perhaps most tellingly, the phrase, "I was elected by the people," had entered the broader political lexicon. Politicians at every level were incorporating variations of it into their speeches and public statements, using it to establish their democratic legitimacy and their right to speak on behalf of their constituents. 2 years after the Roosevelt Room exchange, Jasmine Crockett was chairing the House Subcommittee on Education Policy, a role that would have been unthinkable for someone of her age and experience just a few years earlier. But her viral moment had transformed her from a freshman representative into a national figure whose voice carried weight far beyond her years in office. More importantly, the culture of political discourse had begun to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. The idea that belonging in American democracy was determined by election results rather than background or connections had gained broader acceptance. Politicians were being held to higher standards of respect and civility, particularly when interacting with colleagues from different backgrounds. The education reforms that Jasmine had been advocating